In this video, I'm going to walk you through getting started with StratusForms and some of the examples for StratusForms from the GitHub repository, so you can kind of understand how the library works and how you can start making changes and just get something working right away. So let's just dig in and get started. Here I am in my GitHub repository, and I'm going to go to the StratusForms repository where we have all the files, and the latest version is version 1.4, which just got released today, when I created this video. And what I'm going to do is just download this repository and just download it as it is. I am then going to come into my SharePoint site, and here I have a brand new empty site collection in SharePoint Online. And you can do this in SharePoint 2007, 2010, 2013, 2016, and Office 365, but the demos I'm doing today are on Office 365 on a site collection. And you could also do it in a site too. It doesn't have to be a site collection, just so you know. So here I am, brand new empty site collection, and I am going to go into my site assets document library. So I'm going to go to site contents, site assets, and now I am just going to drag and drop all of those files from GitHub into my site assets document library. And again, this is just to get things started, just so you can use those examples as is with as little effort as possible. So just take all the files and throw them in there. So this will take a second to finish uploading. And most of these files are from some of the supporting libraries that I use. It's not StratusForms itself. StratusForms itself is fairly lightweight. All right, so those files have been loaded, and as you see, we have our two core StratusForms file, which is StratusForms-1.4. That's the main StratusForms engine. And then I've got this other file called StratusForms Data SP Services, and that is the library responsible for doing the read-write operations and actually communicating with SharePoint. And then we have our examples here for the different types of examples I built with the source code. And what we're going to do, though, is we're going to implement the timesheet example. So to implement the timesheet example, we need to do a couple of things. We need to create a couple of lists. So I'm going to go add an app, and I'm going to add a custom list, and I'm going to call it projects. And that's because our timesheet has a drop-down list of projects, and we are going to load those projects from a list called projects. So I'm creating this projects list, and now I'm going to add a couple of entries to the list, so there's some information in there for our drop-down list. So let me just do a quick edit here, and I'll add a couple of entries. Project A, Project B, another project, and one more. Okay, so now we have a list of projects. This is just a regular SharePoint list. Now I need to add one more list, and that is going to be the list that actually stores all the form data. So I'm going to add another app, add a custom list, and I'm going to call this timesheet. And this is going to be the list that's going to store our StratusForms data. Now for any list or library that's going to store StratusForms data, you have to create a specific field in that list. So we're going to go into our list settings, and we are going to create a column, and that column is called StratusForms Data. This must be a multiple lines of text field, and it must be plain text. Okay, and this is the field that's responsible for storing all of the data within that form. So we've got that list created, and that's pretty much all there is to it. We are now set up to use StratusForms. So to get the timesheet example to work, from the demos, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to create a page to put that form on. So I'm going to go into my site contents, then go to my site pages, and I am going to create a web part page, and I'm going to call this page timesheet. You can actually call it whatever you want. You don't have to call it timesheet. but I'll call it timesheet. Okay, so now I'm going to add a web part to this page. I'm going to add a media and content editor web part. And then I'm going to edit this web part. And I need to link it to the file from the examples. So if we go back and look at my site assets, so we look at the site assets here, and I want to do the timesheet. So it's under timesheet. And I'm wanting to do this minimal example, the very minimal timesheet example. So I need to link to minimal timesheet JS. So that was in site assets, timesheet, minimal timesheet.js, and I'll apply that. And here we can see that it puts this form on our page for us. So I'll stop editing. So for now, for this form, this example form does show off a couple of different functionalities. One of them is the people picker. So I can come in here and put my name in here. It will resolve my name. I'm using a date picker field, so I can select a date. Here's that list of projects. So you can see those projects that we entered, another project, one more, project A, project B. So I can select a project and enter some time. I'm also showing the repeating content functionality. So I can click on add row and I can select another project and enter more time. Then when all is said and done, I'm going to update this entry and it says the save was successful. And then the page is going to reload with that same entry. So what I want you to see from here is that the query string up here has the ID of the item that it's loading. And so when the page reloaded, it's saying load the form with the ID of 1. So if I remove this query string parameter of form ID, the form is now empty. So I can create another entry. And if I put it back and I say form ID equals to 1, it's going to load that entry with the ID of 1. So if I put a 2 in there, it's not going to load a 2 because there is no item with an ID of 2, so there's nothing to load. So let's go ahead and create another entry. So let's just get rid of that query string. And I will create one more entry here. And we'll just have one project and create that. So now if we look at the actual timesheet list, we can see how that data gets stored. You can see that there is this field, that StratusForms data field has all of the data for the form as a JSON object. What this allows us to do is allows us to add additional fields easily to the form without having to add additional fields to the list itself. So if we come back in here, so let's go ahead and let's edit our form and let's take a closer look at some of the script and the way that stuff works. So I'm going to go into the timesheet example, which is under my site assets, timesheet, and we have two files. We have a JavaScript file and an HTML file. So first, let's open up the JavaScript file. And in this file, I am referencing several libraries. It's all the libraries that I need for that form to work. I'm referencing jQuery. I'm referencing jQuery UI because I'm using that for the date picker. I'm referencing SP services because SP services is being used for the CRUD operations. And then I'm referencing the StratusForms libraries. Additionally, I'm referencing a CSS file and also the files needed to do the people picker functionality when you saw for the people picker. The people picker does not work on SharePoint 2010 or 2007. That is a 2013 and 2016 feature only. So from within this form, or this JavaScript file, we have two main functions that need to be called. We have this function called StratusForms submit, and this is the function that gets executed when we want to save or update a form. And when you execute this function, you pass into it the name of the list that you want to save the StratusForms data to. And then after that, we have this complete function, and that means what do you want to do after the save is complete? Well, for this example, I'm just alerting out to the user the save was successful and then reloading the page with the new form loaded. The other function is going to be the initialization function, the StratusForms initialize function. And in this function, there's a couple of things that we do here too. There is a new feature from version 1.4 where you can actually specify what HTML file do you want to load for this form. So in addition to being able to load the HTML form here, I could actually come up here to this div that stores the form, and I could put the HTML directly in the same file as well. But by adding the ability to load the HTML file, you could easily load multiple forms for the same list for different content types and that sort of thing. So I'm saying in my initialization of the form that I'm going to load the HTML from minimal timesheet HTML. I'm also telling it that if I'm displaying a form that I want to use the query string variable form ID. So if we go back and look at our page, wherever that page was, let me get back to that page. You can see that it is using form ID as the query string variable. So that script was saying that's what I want to look for to figure out whatever the ID is for the form. I'm then telling it what list to read from. So which list stores the data, and where do I get the ID for the one I'm loading? And then here within the complete function, it's like, what do you want to do after I've loaded the form? And after I'm loading the form, I'm telling it that I want to apply the jQuery UI date picker to that date picker field. And that's all the JavaScript that there is. So now if we look at the HTML, so let's just open that up real quick. We can see this is just going to be a standard HTML that is used for the form with table rows, table cells, some styling. A couple of pieces I want to point out from here is that to use the people picker, we have to specify, we create a div, and we tell that div that we give it this attribute of data StratusForms type of people picker. So when StratusForms sees a div with that attribute, it knows to turn it into a people picker. For dates, we need to tell StratusForms that this is a date field, so it can know how to handle those date fields appropriately. The other thing we had was we had that repeating content to where whenever you could add another row to create more time entries, right? So if we had this ability to click on add row, and we could add additional rows. Well, StratusForms needs to know what am I repeating? What content am I going to repeat? So what we do is our table row contained all of the content that we wanted to repeat. That didn't have to be a table row. It could have been a div. It could have been some other container. But basically it's saying whatever container contains the content you want to repeat, you need to give that container the attribute of data StratusForms repeatable with a value of y. And that basically says this is going to contain the content that you want to repeat. Finally, you need to create some sort of link or button that the user can click to actually create that repeatable content. And here in this example, I'm just creating an anchor that when someone clicks on it, I'm going to execute the StratusForms repeat function, and then I give it the ID of the container that I want to repeat. Okay? The other piece of functionality I want to point out here is that the projects drop-down list that we had. So we had a list of the projects that came from that list. Well, we needed to tell StratusForms how to configure that. And that is done using this attribute called data-StratusForms lookup. So for whatever select that you want to use to have that drop-down list from a list, you would just come in here and give it the attribute of data-StratusForms lookup, and you would fill out these parameters so that StratusForms know where the data comes from. We want to give it the list name, so it's going to come from the projects list. We specify what do we want the first option text to be. In this case, we're telling it that we want to select the project. And then we tell it what field do you want from that list to be in the drop-down list. And we just want to use the title field. And it's important when you're using field names in StratusForms that you use the internal field names and not the display names. So we're saying we want to use the title field as the field we want to look from. There's a lot of other features too with the drop-down list. You can actually pass in custom queries and all sorts of stuff. But again, I just want to get you guys started with this. And then the last thing is we have a button on the page, and when the user clicks on that button, we execute that submit form function. And that submit form function, again, was the function that executes the StratusForms submit and tells it which list to save the form to. And what StratusForms is doing, because you're calling StratusForms submit on this element with the ID of SF form, it's actually going to take every field within that div, and that's how it determines what it's going to save and store into that StratusForms data. Does all that make sense? Let's go ahead and do a couple other things so you can see some things being changed. Let's go into the HTML file and let's go ahead and create another field so you can see how easy it is to create a field. So I'm just going to copy this label and I'm going to put in another one, and we'll call it I don't know, what do you want to call this? Call it name. Maybe you want to type in the name of something. The other thing that's important when you create new fields is that every field has to have a unique ID. So I'm going to give this an ID of name, and it's not a date field, so I'm going to get rid of this stuff. I'm going to say please enter a name. Okay, so I've created a new field in my HTML. I gave it a unique ID, and now I'm going to save it. So when I come back to the form now and reload it, it's going to reload that form, and you can see we have a new field called name field. And so now we can put content in that field, and I'll put in Fred, right? Fred's the name. And I'm going to save it. It says the save was successful, and it reloads that form. And you'll notice that it loaded the old forms data without error. So you can change your forms, and all the old data for the older forms will load properly into your new forms. So the next thing I want to show you guys is let's take that name field, and we want to put that name field into the title field of our list, because like InfoPath, one of the cool things you can do is promote fields in your form to a SharePoint list. So all we have to do that is go back into our HTML, and then for that, if I can find my HTML file, for that field we created, we need to add an attribute called list field name, and we give that the internal field name of the value we want to promote it to. So I want to promote the name field to the title field in my list, and by specifying this attribute and the internal field name, that's all you have to do to promote that field. So I can save the field. Now I can come back to the form, and let's look at the list so you can see that I'm not making things up. So we look at this list entry, we see the title field is empty. But now if I reload it with that list field name in there, and I just update the form again without making any changes, and then come back to this list view and reload it, we see that Fred has now been promoted to the title field. You can also easily promote people fields and date fields. I do recommend that when you're promoting fields to your SharePoint list that you keep it simple. Promote your fields from your form into a single line of text field. The radio button fields, the choice fields, that stuff, it can be a little finicky. So to keep things simple, to make sure things are working, I suggest promoting fields to single line of text fields whenever possible. And if you think about it, it doesn't matter if the field in your list is a choice field, because it is the field in your form that is responsible actually for doing the choice data and giving the user the view of a choice. But let's go ahead and add one more field in here. I'm going to go into my list settings. I'm going to create a field called employee, and that's going to hold the name of the person. So we'll call the field employee, and it will be a person field. And now we will save that. All right, so if we go back to the timesheet list, you can see that we do have this employee field here that's empty. And if I go to my form, I can tell that, hey, I want to promote this field, this employee field. So I'm gonna give it list field name equals employee. And I'm going to save that. So now, when I reload the form and I save it again, I can come back and look at the list, and we should see the employee get promoted to the employee field. Right? So there you see the employee field, which was a people field, got promoted to the people field in the list. So it can handle other things other than single line of text. But again, I do recommend, as you start building out the functionality and promoting fields, promote one field at a time. That is where people have the most problems, is getting all their fields to promote properly. I also recommend only promoting the fields you actually need to create list views for. There's no reason to promote every field in your form to the list if you don't actually need it for a list view. Let's see, a couple other things I can show you guys real quick. You'll notice in the JavaScript initiation, I'm telling it to get the value of the list item from the query string. Well, you can actually, if you don't want to use a query string, you can manually pass in the value of your form, and it will load it using a different parameter. So to do that, instead of using the query string variable parameter, you can use the parameter list ID, and then you could pass in the ID of whatever item that you wanted to load. Maybe that's a variable. It doesn't have to be the actual ID. But I'm going to pass in that I want to load whatever item has the ID of 1. So I can save that, and then when I reload the page, even though the query string variable says 2, it's loading the ID with the item of 1 because I told it that's what I wanted to load. So you would probably never pass in an actual hard-coded ID. You'd probably set a variable and then load it from that. So it's loading, even though there's no query string specified, it's loading the first one. So I come back into the script and say, well, no, I actually want to load something with the ID of 2. And I can reload the page and it will load that other one. So that's just another way you can load forms if you don't want to use that query string parameter. All right. Like I said, there's just a ton of functionality you can do here. Some of the other examples walk you through doing things like field level encryption. There's a rich text editor. I have the ability to do digital signatures now. We can do file uploads. So there's a lot of examples that I want to build on, and I need to update the documentation. There's a ton of documentation that's not been done yet. But dig in, play around, get started. Again, the biggest recommendation I can give you is when you start promoting your fields to a SharePoint list, only promote the fields you absolutely need to, and if you're having problems, try promoting it to a single line of text field and see how that works for you. All right, good luck getting started, and thanks for stopping by.